All right, today is April 28th, and I'm making another promo video here. We're getting to just a little over 2 weeks until my first course begins for my John David Ebert School for the Study of Culture, Cosmology, and the Arts. And the first course is entitled Transformations of Consciousness Through Time. This is it here, and this is the enrollment page. I'll put the link in the bottom for those who wish to enroll. The price is $350 for 8 weeks, beginning on May 14th, every Saturday at noon MST until July 2nd. And it will be 2-hour classes where we'll discuss the ideas of 6 great thinkers of the evolution of consciousness. And so our first thinker will be Rudolf Steiner, and we'll go through his very esoteric and mystical description of the evolution of consciousness, where he describes these various stages that the solar system has gone through, and that also the human subtle body has gone through. And there are 3 pre-physical stages. Sometimes people get confused when he uses terms like old Saturn, old Sun, and old Moon, and think he's talking about the actual planets. During these phases, he is not. The actual physical solar system does not come in until the 4th phase, the earthly phase, the concrete phase. And so we have with old Saturn, the physical body is developed, but paradoxically, only the physical body in an etheric form, which is brought into being by angelic beings, and it becomes the seed for the mineral world of today. That develops for a while, and then it evolves into the old sun period, where plant life begins to evolve, and the etheric body now is constructed. The etheric body is what animates all physical forms that are living. Then animal life, the astral body develops on the old moon period, and the astral body is what all animals have in common, in addition to an etheric body and a physical body. And then he comes to the epoch, the actual evolution of the physical solar system itself, with human beings eventually emerging out of the earth, and we have the development of the soul with an I, or the ego. Steiner uses the terms soul and ego almost interchangeably. And so there will be these 3 future epochs of New Jupiter, New Venus, and Vulcan, with higher spirit aspects being developed. But on the Earth phase, then, he goes through what he has as 7 PostAtlantean phases, where he has the Indian epoch developing on the physical plane now, and as a complete and total superorganism of a civilization, the development of the etheric body. And in the Persian epoch, we have the development of the astral body on the physical plane now. These are being developed by entire civilizations, whereas in the earlier epoch of the planets that we looked at, they're developed, shaped, and guided by Steiner's angelic creator beings. On the Earth, it's different. So, and then we have the development of certain aspects of the soul. The soul is divided by Steiner into a sentient soul, a rational soul, and a consciousness soul. So we have the Egyptian, Sumero-Babylonian epoch developing the sentient soul, and the Greco-Roman epoch developing the rational soul, or what Gene Gebser calls the mental consciousness structure. And the Germanic-Celtic epoch, which is our current Faustian civilization, with the development of the consciousness soul, which has to do with the will and the application of free will and the development of the individual's sense of himself as a unique individual. This is wrong. There will not be a Serbian epoch. There should be Russian. I don't know where this person has gotten this, but there's a future Russian epoch, and then after that, some kind of an American epoch. So we'll look at all these in the course in detail, and then we'll discuss them. And then we'll move on to Sri Aurobindo, the great Indian yogi and thinker, with his idea of the involution of consciousness. It involutes or involves itself in matter, and there's a descent, and then an ascent through transformations of consciousness. And it begins originally with Brahman, which is the one, which is pure energy, that is characterized by Sat Chit Ananda, or being, consciousness, bliss. And then we have the development of the supramental consciousness, which it uses as its tool to create the physical world and to create all the souls, what Aurobindo calls all the Purushas. And then we have the development on the subtle plane of the mental plane, or the Manomaya Kosha, the vital plane, or the Pranamaya Kosha. These correspond to Steiner's intellectual soul and to his etheric body. And the physical plane, or the Annamaya Kosha. Then once the physical plane comes in, and note how closely this corresponds to Steiner, then we have the development of matter, actual physical matter, from out of which life emerges, and from out of that mind emerges, and eventually supermind will be realized on the earth. You can see the symmetry here with the supramental in the cosmic epoch of the creation, and the consciousness hides itself in matter and wants to be released and liberated again for Aurobindo. So we'll look at Aurobindo in detail as well. Then we'll move on down to the more earthly, concrete world of psychology with Jean Gebser and Erich Neumann, both associated with analytical psychology, that is, say, Jungian psychology, where with Jean Gebser we have now just cultural, not a cosmic evolution of consciousness, but an evolution of consciousness that takes place through history, through historical transformations. And first we have the archaic consciousness, which is, he doesn't say much about it. It refers to the hominids. It might be the period of the development of language and tool use way back about 2 million years ago with Homo habilis. And then so eventually we arrive with the Paleolithic, the upper Paleolithic, to the magical consciousness structure, which has to do with spell casting and the idea that everything is a web of interconnection. And all you have to do is know how to manipulate the part for the whole, and you can produce magical effects from that. Shamanism is part of this religious or spiritual mentality. Then with the coming of high civilization, we move into the mutation. And for Gebser, these are all mutations. They just happen. There's no cause for why they come into being. They just happen, and then they organize human social formations accordingly. The mythical consciousness structure then comes in, where we get not a unity, but a polaristic yin-yang division and separation of the world into the world parents, the sky father, and the earth mother, and the macro soul begins to develop out of all of this mythological imagery. Then we move into, with the Greeks, the rational consciousness structure, and note how similar this is to Steiner's idea of the Egypto-Chaldean sentient soul, and moving on then into the Greeks with the intellectual soul. Very, very similar here. So we get the development of rational thinking, thinking in terms of syllogistic reasoning and so forth, that comes in with the Greeks. And the second phase of that begins during the Renaissance with the development of depth perspective in painting and so forth, down to the 19th century, where with modernism, in the middle of the 19th century, we get the integral consciousness structure, which is a spiritualization of matter. It's a spiritual consciousness structure that is able to make use of these previous consciousness structures however it wants to. So that's a brief bird's eye view of Jean Gebser. After that, we will look at the psychologist, the Jungian psychologist, Erich Neumann. Neumann pretty much operates with his evolution of consciousness using the mythical consciousness structure, and also, of course, the mental with the scientific method of psychoanalysis. The mythological stages in the evolution of consciousness. So we'll look at the creation myth, and he starts with the separation of the world parents, the Ouroboros stage, the Great Mother stage, the separation of the world parents, and the principle of opposites. This corresponds very closely to Gebser, and indeed both books came out in the same year, 1949, also the same year as Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and Carl Jaspers's Origin and Goal of History. Those all came out in the same year, all major works. And then the hero myth. Then he moves into a territory that is strikingly similar to what Joseph Campbell was doing, and at about the same time. The hero myth, the birth of the hero, the slaying of the mother, and slaying of the father. We'll look in detail at the significance of each of these, and then finally the transformation myth with the captive and the treasure, and the myth of Osiris. So that's what we'll do with Erich Neumann. Then we'll come down more firmly, even more firmly, to the earth, imitating the model of the descent of consciousness to the physical plane, with two scientists, Taylor Desjardins and Arthur Young. Admittedly, Chardin was a Catholic priest, but he was also a paleoanthropologist who made some pretty specific and concrete discoveries that contributed to understanding hominid evolution. And so we have with Taylor's model here, there's an increase in complexity over time through cosmogenesis. So we have a cosmogenetic process that when it moves onto the physical plane with geogenesis, and then with life to biogenesis, and then through that to homogenesis, and then finally to Christogenesis, all of which is being drawn forward from the future by the telos, or goal of the omega point. homogenesis should actually be new genesis. Taylor doesn't call it that. And so here we see it from creation, the physical universe, imitating almost exactly, or not imitating, but mirroring almost exactly Sri Aurobindo's movement from matter to life to mind to supermind. We move from creation of the physical universe to life to the larger biosphere, to humans, the new sphere, and then eventually toward the Christification of matter and consciousness that will lead onward toward the omega point. So we'll look at all this in detail. And we can see quite a few similarities between all these various thinkers. They have many more similarities than they do have differences, I think. And then we'll move to the engineer, Arthur M. Young. He was an American engineer who invented the Bell helicopter. So this is a much more materialistic, concretistic approach. And in his version of the evolution of consciousness, he sees it as the fall, sinking, and capture of light into matter. So light has complete freedom. So there's a loss as matter develops and moves on into life and mind. With the fall, light gradually loses, there's a gradual loss of freedom. So we have the realm of potential is the realm of light, and the realm of subatomic particles begins the binding process at that point, and there's a loss of a degree of freedom. And then down to the formation of atoms with their radial structure, radial symmetry as he calls it, there's a further loss of freedom. And then finally, at the molecular level, we have the nadir. This is the realm of Newtonian physics. Everything is deterministic here. This is the realm of combination, the slow, heavy, dense realm of physical matter. And then with the coming in of plants now, the radial symmetry of atoms is reachieved, and 1 degree of freedom. The plant has 1 degree of freedom to grow vertically. Animals, on the other hand, have 2 degrees of freedom because they represent the principle of mobility, and they can move in a 360-degree radius in space. So they have bilateral symmetry, the same kind of bilateral symmetry that subatomic particles have. And then finally, with the human domain, we have dominion, where consciousness then, through spiritual practices such as yoga, meditation, transformations of the inner light, then releases the original freedom of light. Human free will reachieves the original freedom of light. And that's Arthur Young's model. It's very concrete, and I wanted to finish with a very concrete, materialistic, solid model, firmly with our feet planted on the ground by this point. So that is the course. That's the outline for it. We will read the books, and we will discuss them for 2 hours from noon to 2 MST. So join us. Again, the price of the course is now $350, and I want to get as many students in here as I possibly can before May 14th comes in. So come join us, and I'll put the sign-up link in the box below.